"Be my wife instead," said a lonely Amish man to the rejected, obese mail-order bride. She stepped off the train, clutching her only hope, a letter promising love. But the moment he saw her, her would-be groom spat in the snow and called off the wedding, leaving her humiliated before the whole town. Everyone turned their backs, except one quiet farmer in plain black clothes. He didn't mock her. He simply said 7 words that silenced the station. "Be my wife instead." What began as mercy soon became something deeper, but the bishop called it sin. The town whispered that their love had cursed the land. Wells dried, and the sky withheld its rain. Still, she refused to leave him. He refused to deny her. Together they faced the drought, the scorn, and the silence of heaven itself. But when the world believes your love offends God, how far would you go to prove it's holy? And when judgment finally comes, will it bring ruin or redemption? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Sarah stared at the stranger before her, his kind blue eyes steady beneath the brim of his plain black hat. The wind whipped snow around them, catching in his beard and the folds of his simple coat. Her fingers trembled on her carpet bag as she tried to make sense of his words. Be your wife?" she whispered, hardly daring to believe someone would want her after Mr. Blakely's cruel rejection. The memory of his sneering face and the crowd's laughter made her cheeks burn anew. Levi Stoltzfus nodded solemnly. "Yeah, if you're willing. I have a farm 10 miles west of here. It needs a woman's touch." His voice was gentle, with the slight accent she recognized as Pennsylvania Dutch. "I can't promise much beyond honest work and a roof over your head, but you'll be treated with respect." Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. This man, this stranger, was offering her salvation from complete ruin. She studied his weathered face, noting the sadness in his eyes that spoke of his own struggles. There was nothing of Mr. Blakely's polished manner about him, but his quiet dignity drew her. "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the wind's howl. "Because it's what the good Lord would have me do," Levi answered simply, "and because I know what it is to be alone." The depot platform had emptied now, leaving them in the growing dusk. Sarah clutched his offered blanket tighter around her shoulders, feeling its rough warmth. She thought of her empty purse, her family's shame if she returned home, and the crushing weight of her own fears. I should tell you that I'm not much of a beauty," she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "That's why Mr. Blakely—" Levi held up a calloused hand. "Beauty fades. A kind heart and willing spirit matter more." He paused, then added softly, "I had a wife once, Rachel. She and our little one were taken by fever 2 years past. I've learned that God's grace often comes in unexpected ways." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes at the raw honesty in his voice. Here was a man who knew sorrow, yet chose to reach out in kindness. The wind gusted harder, rattling the depot's windows, but in that moment a warmth bloomed in her chest that had nothing to do with the blanket. If you're certain," she said, straightening her shoulders, "then yes, Mr. Stoltzfus, I accept your proposal." A hint of a smile touched Levi's lips. "Levi," he corrected gently, "we should be plain with each other if we're to be man and wife." He bent to pick up her scattered belongings, carefully tucking them into her carpet bag. "The minister lives just down the street. We can have the ceremony now, before dark." Sarah nodded, recognizing the practical wisdom in his words. As they walked through the swirling snow, she sent up a silent prayer of gratitude. Perhaps Mr. Blakely's cruel rejection had been God's way of leading her to a better path. The minister's house was small but warm, his wife offering Sarah a cup of hot tea while they waited for him to finish his evening prayers. When he entered his study, Levi explained their situation with simple honesty. The older man's kind eyes crinkled as he looked between them. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, reaching for his Bible. "Love can grow from the smallest seed of faith." Standing before the minister's fireplace, Sarah's hand trembled slightly as it met Levi's work-roughened one. The familiar words of the ceremony washed over her. To have and to hold, in sickness and in health, taking on new meaning as she glimpsed the quiet strength in her soon-to-be husband's face. When Levi spoke his vows, his voice was clear and steady. Sarah's own voice grew stronger as she repeated the sacred words, feeling as though each promise was binding not just their lives, but their wounded hearts as well. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder," the minister pronounced solemnly. "You may kiss your bride." Levi's kiss was gentle and brief, but Sarah felt its warmth spread through her entire being. His hands were tender as he helped her back into her coat, wrapping the blanket securely around her shoulders once more. Outside, the snow had begun to fall more heavily, but Sarah barely noticed the cold. As Levi helped her into his waiting wagon, she caught sight of the depot where, just hours ago, she had faced the deepest humiliation of her life. Now, watching her new husband check the harness with careful attention, she marveled at how God could turn sorrow into hope in the space of a single afternoon. The snow crunched beneath their boots as Levi led Sarah to his waiting horse. Steam rose from the animal's nostrils in the cold evening air, its dark coat flecked with white from the falling snow. Sarah hesitated, eyeing the tall mount with uncertainty. "Here," Levi said softly, removing his thick wool cloak. With gentle hands, he wrapped it around her shoulders, adding another layer of warmth over the blanket she already wore. "I'll help you up." Behind them, the train whistle pierced the winter silence, its mournful cry echoing across the empty platform. Sarah flinched at the sound, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks as she remembered the cruel laughter that had filled this space just hours before. Levi cupped his hands to make a step, his strength steady and sure. "Put your foot here," he instructed. "Hold the pommel tight." With his guidance, Sarah managed to settle herself in the saddle, gathering her skirts around her legs. The height made her dizzy for a moment, but Levi's presence beside her was reassuring. He took the reins and began leading the horse on foot, their progress slow but steady through the deepening snow. The rhythmic clip-clop of hooves against the ground seemed to match Sarah's gradually calming heartbeat. As they left the town behind, the only sounds were the whisper of wind through bare branches and the soft crunch of Levi's boots breaking trail. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered after a while, her voice thick with tears. "I've caused you such trouble, making you travel in this weather." Levi glanced up at her, snowflakes caught in his beard. "God brings no souls together by mistake," he said simply. His words carried the weight of deep conviction, warming her more than any cloak could. As they traveled, Levi spoke quietly of his life. "I'm Amish," he explained, though Sarah had already guessed as much from his plain dress. "My wife Rachel and our son Samuel." His voice caught slightly. "We lost them 3 winters ago to fever. The Lord's ways are sometimes hard to understand." Sarah's heart ached for the pain she heard beneath his measured words. "I'm so very sorry," she murmured, understanding now the shadow of grief she'd seen in his eyes. The short winter day was fading fast, darkness creeping in between the snowflakes. Levi's horse knew the way home, following the familiar path without hesitation. Finally, through the gloom, Sarah spotted a warm glow of lamplight, As they drew closer, she made out the shape of a low wooden house, smoke rising from its chimney into the purple-gray sky. Levi helped her down from the horse, her legs stiff from the cold ride. "Wait here," he said, leading the animal to the barn. He returned quickly, stamping snow from his boots before opening the house door. The interior was simple but clean, warmed by a pot-bellied stove. A kerosene lamp cast golden light across worn wooden furniture. Everything spoke of careful maintenance, though Sarah noticed the feminine touches, curtains, quilts, showed signs of age and wear. "I'll fix us something to eat," Levi said, moving to the stove where a pot of stew had been simmering. "You must be hungry." Sarah hadn't thought she could eat, her stomach still knotted with the day's emotions, but the savory smell made her realize how long it had been since breakfast on the train. Levi served them both bowls of the hearty stew, accompanied by thick slices of homemade bread. They ate in comfortable silence, the stove's warmth slowly thawing Sarah's chilled body. When they finished, Levi cleared the dishes with efficient movements that spoke of long practice. "I'll sleep in the barn loft," he said, gathering a spare blanket. "You can take the bed upstairs. It was Rachel's." His voice held no expectation, only gentle courtesy. "There are fresh linens in the chest." Sarah wanted to protest, to say she could sleep elsewhere, but the genuine kindness in his offer stopped her. Instead, she managed a quiet, "Thank you." After Levi left for the barn, Sarah climbed the narrow stairs to the bedroom. A simple bed with a handmade quilt occupied one corner. Everything was neat, but there was an emptiness that spoke of long disuse. Kneeling beside the bed, Sarah clasped her hands and bowed her head. "Dear Lord," she whispered, her voice trembling, "is this real? This kindness seems too much to hope for, after everything." She thought of Levi's gentle strength, his quiet faith, the way he'd offered help without hesitation or judgment. "Please let it be real," she prayed, "and please help me be worthy of such mercy." The wind whistled outside the window, but inside, wrapped in Rachel's quilt, Sarah felt the first stirrings of peace. Whatever tomorrow might bring, for tonight at least, she was safe, warm, and treated with dignity. Gifts she hadn't dared to hope for when she'd stepped off that train just hours ago. Golden morning light spilled across the snow-covered farmyard, turning the crystalline drifts into fields of diamonds. Sarah woke to unfamiliar sounds, the low mooing of cattle, the distant whinny of horses, and the rhythmic chopping that told her Levi was already at his morning chores. From her window she watched him cross the yard, his breath visible in the crisp air as he carried fresh hay to the barn. His movements were sure and practiced, speaking of years tending this land. Sarah pulled Rachel's shawl tighter around her shoulders, gathering courage to venture downstairs. The kitchen stood quiet and clean, everything in its proper place. Sarah ran her fingers along the smooth wooden counter, noting the absence of the modern conveniences she'd known in Pennsylvania. No fancy plates or decorative touches adorned the shelves, just simple, practical items meant for daily use. "Lord, give me wisdom," she whispered, opening cupboards until she found coffee and cornmeal. She had cooked before, but never on a wood-burning stove. Determined to prove useful, she filled the coffee pot and attempted to adjust the damper as she'd seen her mother do years ago. Within minutes, smoke began billowing from beneath the stove lids. Sarah frantically tried to control it, but only managed to make things worse. The kitchen filled with gray clouds just as Levi stepped through the door. Instead of anger, a gentle chuckle escaped him. "Here," he said, moving beside her. "Let me show you." His capable hands adjusted the damper and repositioned the pot. "The fire needs coaxing, not commanding." Sarah's cheeks burned with embarrassment. "I'm sorry, I should know better." No shame in learning, Levi replied, opening a window to clear the smoke. Rachel struggled with it too, when she first came. His voice held no bitterness at mentioning his late wife, only fond remembrance. As the morning brightened, Levi explained the rhythms of Amish life while they worked together to prepare a simple breakfast. We live plain, he said, keeping our focus on God rather than worldly things. He gestured to the unadorned walls. No mirrors here. They encourage vanity. We speak when words have purpose, not to fill silence. Sarah nodded, something easing in her chest. It sounds peaceful. She hesitated, then added, I used to dream of being a teacher before. She trailed off, remembering her family's insistence that marriage was her only option. You have a teacher's patience, Levi observed, watching her carefully measure coffee grounds. Perhaps God will use that gift here, in time. They sat together at the sturdy table, steam rising from their cups. Sarah found herself sharing more of her story, her love of books, her hope of shaping young minds, the pressure to marry well despite her plain looks. Levi listened without judgment, his blue eyes thoughtful. The bishop will visit soon, he said after a while. We should marry before the next Sabbath, to honor God and quiet any gossip that might harm your reputation. Sarah's hands trembled slightly. So soon? Unless you've changed your mind? His tone held no pressure, only gentle concern. No, Sarah said quickly. I mean, yes, I still wish to marry you. She found herself smiling, surprising herself with how right it felt. A simple ceremony would be best. As evening approached, Levi built up the fire while Sarah cleaned away their supper dishes. The familiar tasks felt different now, weighted with purpose and belonging. When the kitchen was in order, Levi gestured for her to join him by the hearth. We should pray together, he said softly, as we mean to live our lives. Sarah knelt beside him on the rough wooden floor. Levi's voice rose steady and sure in the lamplight. Lord, guide our steps as we build this marriage on your foundation. Grant us wisdom to serve you together and hearts to serve each other. His words wrapped around her like a warm blanket, calming the last of her fears. Through the window she heard coyotes calling across the frozen plains, wild and lonely sounds that only made the warmth inside more precious. Amen, she whispered, and felt Levi's hand briefly touch hers, a promise of partnership, of shared faith, of simple devotion that asked nothing more than what she could gladly give. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the vast Kansas night stretched endless and cold, but here, in this plain wooden house, Sarah felt the first true stirrings of home. The following afternoon, Levi hitched his bay mare to the plain black buggy while Sarah watched from the porch, clutching a small bundle containing her best dress. Snow had begun falling again, dusting everything in a fine powder that sparkled in the winter sun. The preacher's staying at the Miller place, Levi explained, helping Sarah up onto the wooden seat. About 5 miles east. He tucked a thick wool blanket around her legs before climbing up beside her. The leather reins felt familiar in his hands as he clicked his tongue, urging the horse forward. They rode in comfortable silence, the buggy's wheels crunching through fresh snow. Sarah watched the vast Kansas prairie roll past, white drifts broken only by scattered homesteads and bare-branched trees. The sky hung low and pearl gray, promising more snow to come. At the Miller homestead, they found preacher Eli Matthews warming himself by the kitchen fire. He was a weathered man in a black coat, Bible worn smooth at the corners from years of frontier ministry. His eyebrows rose slightly at their request. An Amish man and an English woman? The preacher studied them carefully. That's unusual. Are you certain about this? The Lord brought us together, Levi said simply, his quiet voice carrying conviction. We ask only for His blessing and yours. Sarah stood straight despite her trembling hands. Please, Preacher Matthews, we wish to honor God in this. The preacher looked between them for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Well, I reckon the good book says nothing against it, though your people might see things different, Mr. Stoltzfus. They might, Levi agreed, but my conscience is clear. Mrs. Miller, the preacher's host, brought out her best lamp and set it on the kitchen table. Its warm glow filled the room as evening shadows lengthened outside. Sarah smoothed her dark blue dress, the nicest she owned, while Levi stood tall in his plain black coat and hat. The preacher opened his Bible, its pages rustling in the quiet room. Join hands, he instructed softly. Sarah's fingers trembled as she placed them in Levi's strong, work-roughened grip. His touch steadied her, warm and sure. The familiar words of the ceremony washed over them. Love, honor, cherish. Sarah's voice shook slightly as she repeated her vows, but Levi's calm presence beside her gave her strength. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes, not of sorrow this time, but of gratitude. Levi's thumb brushed them gently away before he led her back to the waiting buggy. Snow fell more heavily as they drove home, fat flakes catching in the horse's mane. The temperature had dropped, but Sarah felt warmed by more than just the blanket across her lap. Levi's shoulder pressed against hers, solid and reassuring. Back at the cabin, Levi built up the fire while Sarah brewed coffee. They sat together on the hearth, watching flames dance behind the iron grate. When Levi told a gentle story about his first attempts at baking bread, Sarah found herself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in years. The sound seemed to surprise them both. It's good to hear joy in this house again, Levi said softly, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. Sarah's heart swelled with affection for this quiet, steadfast man who had offered her not just shelter, but dignity and purpose. They talked long into the evening, sharing coffee and simple dreams, while winter winds whispered outside. The peace of their wedding night was broken at dawn by the sharp rap of knuckles on the cabin door. Sarah, already up to help with morning chores, opened it to find two elderly Amish men standing on the porch. Their stern faces made her step back involuntarily. We would speak with Levi Stoltzfus, the taller one said, barely glancing at her. Levi appeared behind her, laying a gentle hand on her shoulder. Brothers Weber and Yoder, he greeted them calmly. Come in from the cold. The elders stepped inside, but remained standing, their dark hats held stiffly before them. Brother Weber spoke first, his words clipped with disapproval. Word has reached us that you have taken an English bride, without the blessing of the church or the bishop's permission. It is true, Levi replied simply. Explain yourself, Brother Stoltzfus, Brother Yoder demanded. Why would you do such a thing? Levi's voice remained steady, though Sarah felt his hand tighten slightly on her shoulder. Because the Lord laid it on my heart. A heavy silence filled the cabin. The elders exchanged dark looks before Brother Weber spoke again. The bishop will hear of this. Without another word, they turned and walked out, their boots leaving sharp prints in the fresh snow. Sarah turned to Levi, worry creasing her brow, but he only drew her close. Through the window, they watched the elder's buggy disappear into the snowy morning, the weight of unspoken judgment hanging in the bitter air. Word traveled fast across the Kansas prairie, carried on winter winds from farm to farm. By Wednesday morning, the change was plain to see. Wagons that once stopped to trade news now hurried past Levi's farm without slowing. Faces that had been friendly turned away when Sarah and Levi drove their buggy to town. At Henderson's general store, Sarah waited by the wagon while Levi went to purchase spring seed. Through the dusty window, she watched Mr. Henderson shake his head, arms crossed. When Levi returned empty-handed, his expression was troubled but calm. "He says he's promised his seed corn to others," Levi explained, helping Sarah back into the buggy. They both knew it for the lie it was. That evening, as they sat at the kitchen table over bowls of stew, Sarah's spoon pushed listlessly at her food. "Perhaps," she began hesitantly, "perhaps I should go. Find work in Garden City or—" "No." Levi's voice was gentle but firm. He reached across the table to cover her hand with his. "We will walk the path God gives us, Sarah. Together." The next morning dawned clear and cold. They set to work side by side, Sarah learning the rhythm of farm life as Levi taught her. She helped him mend the winter-damaged fences, holding boards steady while he hammered. Her hands grew rough with honest work, but her heart grew lighter. In the kitchen, Sarah discovered a talent for baking she hadn't known she possessed. The familiar motions of kneading bread dough soothed her worried mind. Soon, she found herself humming hymns as she worked, then singing softly under her breath. The sound filled the once quiet house with gentle music. "My mother taught me that one," she explained, when Levi paused in the doorway to listen. A smile tugged at his mouth as he watched her shape the dough with sure hands. "It suits you," he said simply. "The singing." But their peaceful routine was shattered that afternoon by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Sarah looked up from her wash basket to see a tall figure on horseback approaching the farm. Even at a distance, there was no mistaking the stern bearing of Bishop Amos Yoder. Levi set down his saw and walked to meet him, wiping sawdust from his hands. Sarah hung back near the house, her heart pounding as the two men spoke. The bishop's voice carried clearly across the yard, sharp with authority. "This cannot stand, Levi Stoltzfus. You know our ways. To marry outside the faith, without permission, it goes against all order." The bishop's gray beard bristled with disapproval. "Dissolve this marriage. Send the English woman away, or you will be shunned." Sarah's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. To be shunned meant complete isolation from the Amish community. No one would speak to Levi, trade with him, or acknowledge his existence. It was a death sentence for his way of life. But Levi stood straight and calm, his voice respectful but unwavering. "I cannot do that, Bishop. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." "Think carefully, Levi." The bishop's warning hung heavy in the air. "You have until Sunday to change your mind." They watched him ride away, the horse's hooves kicking up dust in the late afternoon sun. Sarah's hands trembled as she gathered her wash, tears threatening to spill over. Everything she'd feared was coming true. Because of her, Levi would lose his entire community, his people, his heritage, his way of life. That night, lying in the darkness of their bedroom, Sarah could no longer hold back her grief. Silent tears soaked her pillow as she thought of all Levi would sacrifice. She tried to muffle her sobs, but Levi's hand found hers across the quilts. "I'm so sorry," she whispered brokenly. "I've cost you everything." "No." Levi's voice came soft but certain through the darkness. His calloused thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "Better to lose men's favor than God's mercy, Sarah. He brought you to my door that day. I believe that with all my heart." His quiet faith steadied her, as it had since that first snowy afternoon at the train station. Sarah squeezed his hand, drawing strength from his unwavering certainty. Together they lay in the darkness, listening to the wind whisper across the prairie, holding fast to each other and to their trust in God's purpose. Spring came slowly to Kansas that year, creeping across the prairie with reluctant steps. The morning frost lingered longer than usual, and when it finally retreated, the warming earth revealed troubling signs. Where the wheat should have sprouted thick and green, only scattered stalks pushed through the dry soil. Sarah stood at the edge of their field, watching Levi examine the stunted shoots. His shoulders carried the weight of worry, though his voice remained steady. "The good Lord provides," he said, running a withered blade of wheat between his fingers. "We must trust in his timing." But as the days lengthened, the creek that bordered their property grew quieter, its voice reduced to a whisper. Soon, hairline cracks appeared in the creek bed, spreading like spiderwebs across the parched earth. The spring that had sustained the farm for years now lay a quarter-mile away, forcing them to haul water bucket by bucket across the dusty ground. Each morning before dawn, Sarah joined Levi in this new ritual. The wooden yoke across their shoulders creaked as they carried their precious cargo, footsteps matching in the gray light. Some days, they made the journey 6 or 7 times before the sun set. "My arms may ache," Sarah said one afternoon, rubbing her shoulders, "but at least they're growing stronger." Her attempt at humor brought a gentle smile to Levi's face. Despite the hardship, a different kind of growth flourished between them. In the quiet evenings, after the animals were tended and supper dishes cleared, Sarah would take out the family Bible. Her clear voice filled their home as she read by lamplight, while Levi's skilled hands worked at mending harness or carving replacement handles for worn tools. The livestock seemed to sense Sarah's growing confidence. The chickens came running at her approach, and even the shy milk cow, Betsy, learned to trust her touch. "You have healing hands," Levi observed one morning as he watched her gentle way with a limping colt. But not everyone saw Sarah's worth so clearly. In town, whispers followed her like shadows. She caught fragments of conversations that fell silent when she passed. "Drought's no accident?" and "God's punishment for mixing?" The tension came to a head one afternoon when Sarah visited Whitaker's Mercantile for flour. The bell above the door announced her entrance, and conversation died as suddenly as a candle snuffed out. Mrs. Whitaker, who had always been civil if not warm, now stood rigid behind the counter. "We cannot serve you," the woman declared, her voice carrying in the silent store. "My husband says it isn't right, with things being as they are." Sarah felt the familiar heat of humiliation rise in her cheeks, but something else rose with it. A quiet strength born of months of shared labor and love. She thought of Levi's unwavering faith, of their evening prayers together, of the peace that had grown between them despite every hardship. Setting her empty basket down with deliberate care, Sarah straightened her plain dress and met Mrs. Whitaker's gaze. "I understand," she said clearly, her voice steady. "God's peace be with you." Then she turned and walked out, her steps measured and dignified. The afternoon sun was setting behind the barren hills when she returned home, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Levi looked up from where he was repairing a fence post, concern crossing his features when he saw her empty hands. Sarah told him what had happened, her voice growing stronger with each word. "They think to break us with their judgment," she said, squaring her shoulders. "But they will not break me, not now, not ever." Levi's weathered face broke into a proud smile that rivaled the sunset's glory. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. They stood together, watching the sun sink behind the hills that had become their shared home. The wheat might be thin, the creek might run dry, but something else had taken root and flourished. Something stronger than drought or disapproval. In the growing darkness, they could hear the evening wind whispering through the sparse wheat stalks, a sound like prayer. The Kansas summer settled over the land like a heavy blanket, thick and stifling. Heat shimmered above the stunted wheat fields, and even the morning breeze carried no relief. Inside their modest home, Sarah wiped sweat from her brow as she wrapped cornbread and dried beef for Levi's midday meal. "The well's running low again," Levi said, his voice rough from the dry air. "We'll need to dig deeper if we're to make it through August." He stood in the doorway, shoulders squared against the weight of their situation. Sarah nodded, already reaching for her bonnet. "I'll help carry stones to line it," she said. Together they stepped into the merciless sun, their shadows sharp against the parched earth. Hour after hour, they worked in practiced rhythm. Levi's shovel bit deeper into the earth while Sarah gathered stones from the creek bed, now completely dry. Her arms ached as she carried each load, but she refused to rest. The pile of stones grew slowly beside the well's opening. "Mind the edge," Levi cautioned as she brought another load. His voice echoed up from the depths, followed by a sudden, harsh coughing fit that made Sarah's heart clench with worry. "Perhaps we should stop for today," she suggested, but Levi shook his head, determination etched in the lines of his face. "The Lord gives strength for what must be done," he said, though. His breathing remained labored. The days blended together in an endless cycle of work. Sarah's hands grew calloused from the rough stones, her skin weathered by sun and wind. Yet she found a strange peace in the labor, as if each stone placed was another step away from the woman she'd been, the rejected mail-order bride who'd arrived in winter. One particularly brutal afternoon, she heard running footsteps approaching the farm. Young Tommy Weber, a neighbor's son, stumbled into their yard. His face was red, his lips cracked from dehydration. "Please," he gasped, barely able to speak. "Water." Sarah looked at their last bucket of drinking water, carefully rationed for the day. Without hesitation, she lifted it to the boy's lips. "Drink slowly," she instructed, supporting his head as he swallowed. From the well, Levi watched, his blue eyes softened with pride at his wife's instinctive generosity. It was the same mercy that had drawn him to her that snowy day at the train station, now blooming fully despite the drought's harsh test. That evening, Levi's coughing grew worse. Sarah helped him to bed early, her heart heavy as each fit shook his strong frame. When he finally fell into restless sleep, she knelt beside their bed, her prayer whispered into the darkness. "Lord, send us rain," she pleaded, "and please spare him this sickness. I cannot lose another home." Her words carried all the fear she wouldn't show by day. Morning brought no relief from the heat, but it did bring an unexpected visitor, the telegraph boy from Garden City, his horse lathered from the long ride. Sarah's hands trembled as she accepted the yellow envelope, recognizing the Pennsylvania return address. Standing in their kitchen, she broke the seal and read the brief message. Her parents, who had turned their backs when she agreed to become a mail-order bride, had succumbed to fever within days of each other. The news struck her like a physical blow, yet she felt strangely distant from it, as if reading about strangers. Levi found her there, still holding the telegram. "Sarah?" he asked softly, concern clear in his voice despite his weakened state. "My parents," she said. "They're gone." She looked around their humble home, at the scripture verses she'd carefully copied and hung on the walls, at Levi's mother's quilt draped over their chair, at the simple life they'd built together. Here was where she belonged now. Walking to the hearth, Sarah struck a match and held it to the telegram's envelope. The paper caught quickly, curling into ash. As she watched it burn, she felt the last threads binding her to her old life dissolve. The shame of rejection, the weight of never being enough, all of it turned to smoke and drifted away. "The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away," she said quietly. "But he has given me more than he took." She turned to find Levi watching her, understanding in his tired eyes. Another coughing fit seized him then, and Sarah moved quickly to his side, supporting him until it passed. The sound of his labored breathing filled their small home, mixing with the endless drone of cicadas outside and the whisper of hot wind through the dying wheat. Yet as she held him, Sarah felt the strange peace that had been growing in her heart take deeper root. She was no longer the woman who had stepped off that train in January, lost and unwanted. She had found her purpose here, in love freely given, in mercy shared despite scarcity, in the quiet strength of faith tested by fire. The clouds gathered suddenly one afternoon, dark and heavy with promise. Sarah stood in the dooryard, her face turned skyward as the first drops fell. The pattering became a steady drum on the tin roof, then a mighty downpour that soaked the parched earth. "Levi," she called out, joy breaking through her usual reserve. "Come see." He emerged from the barn, moving with more vigor than he had in weeks. The rain plastered his shirt to his shoulders as he joined her, wonder lighting his weathered face. Together they watched the life-giving water stream down, forming puddles in the yard's hard-packed dirt. "The Lord provides," he said softly, reaching for her hand. Sarah squeezed his fingers, remembering darker days when the sky seemed brass above them. "Yes," she whispered. "He does." The rain continued through the night, gentle but persistent. By morning, green shoots had already begun pushing through the softened soil. Their small barley field, which had seemed beyond hope, stirred with new life. Sarah walked the rows each day, watching the tender stalks strengthen and grow. As the grain ripened, she noticed something that troubled her heart. Families in town were struggling, some near starving. The drought had taken its toll on many. One afternoon, while Levi rested, his cough finally easing, she sat at their table and wrote careful letters to the neighboring farms. "We must help them," she told Levi that evening, "even those who turned away from us." He nodded, pride warming his blue eyes. "The scripture says to love our enemies." Sarah organized a gleaning party, mostly wives and daughters from nearby homesteads. Some came hesitantly at first, uncertain about working alongside the shunned couple. But Sarah's quiet leadership and genuine concern soon wore down their resistance. "Leave the corners of the field," she instructed, remembering the ancient practice she'd read about. "And if you drop any sheaves, let them lie for those in need." The women worked together under the hot sun, their skirts brushing through the golden barley. Sarah noticed Mrs. Weber, young Tommy's mother, watching her with thoughtful eyes. This was the same woman who had crossed the street to avoid her in town just months ago. "You have a generous heart," Mrs. Weber said finally, wiping sweat from her brow. "I was wrong about you both." Sarah ducked her head, touched by the admission. "We all need mercy sometimes," she replied softly. Even the bishop's wife joined them on the third day, her presence a silent acknowledgement that perhaps grace could bridge the widest gaps. The gleaned grain was distributed to those most in need, no questions asked about faith or standing. Levi's strength returned with the cooler evenings. His cough lessened, and color returned to his cheeks. Sarah thanked God silently each time she heard him laugh, a sound that had been too rare during the worst of his illness. One Sunday evening, after a simple supper of bread and stewed apples, they sat together by lamplight. Sarah held their well-worn Bible, turning to the book of Ruth. The familiar story felt different now, more personal than ever before. "Entreat me not to leave thee," she read aloud, "or to return from following after thee, for whither thou goest I will go, and where thou lodgest I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." Levi's hand found hers across the table. "Perhaps you were sent for such a time," he murmured, his voice tender with meaning. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, her heart full to bursting. The lamp's gentle glow softened his features, reminding her of that first night when he'd offered shelter to a stranger. How far they'd come since then, through winter's bite and summer's trial. Through the open window came the evening's cooling breath, carrying the sweet scent of damp earth. Fireflies rose from the wet grass like tiny stars, their light dancing in the gathering dusk. Sarah watched them flicker and glow, each one a small miracle against the darkness. "The drought didn't last forever," she said softly, thinking of both the land's thirst and her own long years of loneliness before finding him. "No," Levi agreed, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "The Lord's mercies are new every morning." They sat in peaceful silence, watching the fireflies rise higher against the purple evening sky. The lamp's flame cast warm shadows on the wall, and somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called. Sarah felt contentment settle over her like a familiar quilt. Not the sharp ache of wanting she'd known most of her life, but the quiet joy of being exactly where she belonged. Autumn painted the prairie in fading gold, but brought bitter winds that cut through clothing like knives. Sarah noticed Levi's cough returning first as a gentle clearing of his throat, then deepening into something that shook his whole frame. Still, he insisted on working, saying the woodpile needed building before winter's grip took hold. She watched from the kitchen window as he swung the axe, his movements growing slower with each log. The thud of splitting wood became irregular, then stopped altogether. When she looked up from her bread-making, Levi was on his knees in the yard, the axe fallen beside him. "Levi." Sarah ran outside, her apron dusted with flour. He tried to wave her off, but she could feel the heat radiating from his body as she helped him to his feet. Together they stumbled inside, his weight heavy against her shoulder. "Just need rest," he mumbled as she eased him onto their bed. But Sarah knew better. His face was flushed with fever, and each breath rattled in his chest like loose wagon wheels on gravel. Through the long night, she tended him with what remedies she knew. She steeped willow bark for tea and laid cool cloths on his forehead, praying as she worked. But by midnight, his fever blazed higher. He tossed in delirium, calling out in Pennsylvania Dutch to people she didn't know. Sarah watched the darkness give way to gray dawn through their small window. The wind howled outside, carrying dust that sifted through every crack. She knew what she had to do. With trembling hands, she saddled their horse. Thunder. The gelding sensed her urgency, standing steady as she mounted. "The Lord ride with us," she whispered, turning his head toward Garden City. The 15-mile ride was brutal. Wind whipped her skirts and stung her eyes with grit. Thunder's hooves kicked up clouds of dust from the drought-parched earth. Sarah bent low over his neck, urging him on, thoughts only of Levi burning with fever in their bed. Garden City's streets were quiet when she arrived, most folks sensible enough to stay indoors on such a bitter morning. The apothecary's bell jangled as she pushed through the door, her legs shaking from the long ride. "Please," she said to Mr. Henderson, the thin-faced proprietor. "My husband is terribly ill. He needs medicine." The apothecary's eyes narrowed with recognition. "You're the Englisher who married that Stoltzfus fellow." He shook his head. "Bishop Yoder made it clear, none of us is to do business with you." "But he could die." Sarah's voice cracked. Tears cut clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "I beg you." "Now, Henderson," a familiar voice interrupted from behind her. "Surely we're not in the business of letting men die over church politics." Sarah turned slowly. There stood Mr. Thomas Blakely, the very man who had rejected and humiliated her at the train station all those months ago. He looked different somehow, the arrogance gone from his stance. "I'll pay for whatever medicines she needs," Blakely continued, meeting Sarah's startled gaze. "And I'll answer to the bishop myself if need be." The apothecary hesitated, then nodded curtly. He began gathering bottles and powders while Sarah stood in shocked silence. "Miss Wilkes, Mrs. Stoltzfus," Blakely corrected himself, his voice low. "What I did to you that day, there's no excuse. You deserved better than me." Sarah's hands clutched her skirt, remembering the sting of his cruel words, the laughter of the crowd. But something had changed in her since then. She was no longer that frightened, shame-filled woman. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice steady despite her tears, "for helping us now. I forgive you." The words came naturally, surprising her with their truth. Blakely's eyes widened, then filled with moisture. He quickly blinked away. Mr. Henderson wrapped the medicines in brown paper, explaining their use in clipped tones. When Sarah reached for her purse, Blakely waved her off. "Please," he said, "let me do this one right thing." Sarah nodded, tucking the precious package into her coat. Her legs trembled as she mounted Thunder for the long ride home, but her heart felt strangely lighter. The wind still bit through her clothing, but she barely noticed it now, focused only on getting the medicine back to Levi. Behind her, Blakely stood in the apothecary doorway, watching until she disappeared into the swirling dust. The man who had once judged her so harshly had become an instrument of God's mercy. Sarah whispered a prayer of thanksgiving as Thunder carried her homeward, the medicine secure against her heart. Thunder's hooves pounded against the hardened earth as Sarah urged him homeward through the gathering dusk, the precious package of medicine pressed against her ribs beneath her cloak, each jostle reminding her of hope. The setting sun painted the Kansas sky in streaks of purple and orange, but she had no time to admire its beauty. "Faster," she whispered to Thunder, though the loyal horse was already giving his all. Dust swirled in their wake as familiar landmarks flew past: the lightning-struck oak, the broken-down wagon, the 3 crosses marking unknown travelers' graves. Each one brought her closer to Levi. When she finally reached their farmstead, Sarah dismounted before Thunder fully stopped, her legs nearly buckling beneath her. She stumbled through the door, heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Levi," she called softly, but no answer came. He lay exactly as she'd left him, still as death on their bed. His skin had taken on a terrifying pallor, white as fresh snow against the dark quilts. Sarah's hands shook as she unwrapped the medicines, reading Henderson's hastily scrawled instructions by lamplight. "Lord," she prayed aloud, measuring doses with trembling fingers, "you brought us together. Please don't separate us now." Her voice grew stronger as she worked, reciting every promise of Scripture she could remember. "I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. Yea, though I walk through the valley of shadow." Sarah lifted Levi's head gently, coaxing the bitter medicine between his lips. His skin burned against her palm, but she refused to let fear overcome her. Through the long hours of night, she kept her vigil. Every hour she spooned fresh broth into his mouth, drop by precious drop. Between doses, she bathed his face and neck with cool cloths, watching helplessly as he tossed in fevered dreams. "Remember our vows," she whispered, holding his hand tight. "In sickness and in health, remember? You can't leave me now, Levi Stoltzfus, not when I've only just learned what love truly means." The hours crawled past like years. Sarah's back ached from sitting beside him, but she dared not rest. She sang hymns, softly, prayed constantly, and watched the stars wheel past their window. The medicine bottles slowly emptied as the night deepened. Near dawn, when the first gray light touched the eastern sky, Sarah noticed a change. Levi's breathing, which had been shallow and rapid, began to slow and deepen. The terrible heat seemed to leave his skin. She pressed her hand to his chest, hardly daring to hope. His eyelids flickered, then slowly opened. Those kind blue eyes that had first offered her sanctuary now focused on her face with recognition. His cracked lips curved in a faint smile. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. Sarah's strength finally failed her. She collapsed forward onto the quilt beside him, tears soaking into the fabric. "Of course I stayed," she managed between sobs. "Where else would I be?" Levi's hand moved slightly, just enough to touch her hair. "Thank you," he murmured, before drifting into natural sleep. The next days passed in a blur of small victories. Sarah helped Levi sit up to take broth, then to remain upright for longer periods. Each day brought more color to his cheeks, more strength to his voice. She read to him from scripture, her heart lifting every time he joined in familiar verses. A week after the fever broke, Levi insisted on walking outside. Sarah wrapped him in his warmest coat, though autumn sunshine warmed the air. He leaned heavily on her arm as they made their slow way across the yard, but his steps grew more certain with each passing moment. "Look there," he said, pointing to where green shoots pushed through the dusty soil. "Winter wheat's coming up despite everything." Sarah followed his gaze, hope warring with worry in her heart. Their grain stores had dwindled dangerous low during his illness. The drought had left them with mounting debts at the feed store, and winter loomed ahead like a hungry wolf. But Levi was alive, standing beside her in the sunshine. For this moment, that was enough. "God provides," she said softly, steadying him as he turned back toward the house. "One day at a time." Levi's hand tightened on her arm. "He sent me you," he replied. "Everything else is grace beyond measure." Together they made their way back inside, each step slow but purposeful. The future held no certainty except their faith and each other. For now, that would have to be enough. The autumn weeks slipped past like fallen leaves in the wind. Each morning brought new worries to the farmstead, where empty grain bins and mounting debts cast long shadows over Sarah and Levi's hard-won peace. Their small harvest had barely filled 3 sacks where 20 should have stood, and the drought's legacy haunted every corner of their land. Sarah watched helplessly as Levi's shoulders grew more burdened with each passing day. Though his strength had returned after the fever, his steps dragged whenever he returned from town. The creditors' letters arrived with increasing frequency, their demands growing more insistent. Each envelope bore the weight of promises they struggled to keep. One particularly bitter evening, Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching Levi talk with 2 men in dark suits beside their polished wagon. Even from a distance, she could read the defeat in his posture. When he finally came inside, his face was drawn with worry. They're threatening foreclosure," he said quietly, settling into his chair by the hearth. 3 weeks to make good, or we lose everything." Sarah's heart clenched. She knew what everything meant. Not just the farm, but Levi's place in his community. The bishop had already withdrawn fellowship. Losing the land would confirm every whispered judgment about their marriage, bringing God's disfavor. That night, after Levi had fallen into exhausted sleep, Sarah sat alone at the kitchen table. The lamp's dim light caught the silver threads in her dark hair as she counted their meager savings for the 100th time. The coins wouldn't cover even a quarter of what they owed. Her eyes drifted to the worn trunk in the corner, the same one she'd arrived with less than a year ago. A thought that had been growing in her mind for weeks suddenly crystallized into terrible clarity. If she left, returned east to her distant cousins, Levi might have a chance to recover. Without an outsider wife, perhaps the community would welcome him back, help him save the farm. The decision felt like a knife in her heart, but Sarah forced herself to act before courage failed her. Moving quietly in the darkness, she packed the trunk with trembling hands. Her few dresses, the Bible her mother had given her, a small photo of Levi she'd secretly purchased in town. Each item felt heavier than the last. When the trunk was full, Sarah sat at the table and wrote by lamplight, tears falling onto the paper. "My dearest Levi, you gave me worth when I had none. That must be enough. I cannot bear to be the millstone that drags you under. Perhaps without me, you can rebuild what my presence has cost you. Know that my heart stays here, though duty bids me go. Your Sarah." She placed the note carefully beside his Bible, where he would find it during morning prayers. Then she crept out to the barn, her boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. The stars watched silently as she hitched the buggy, her hands remembering all Levi had taught her about leather and buckles. Just as she lifted the trunk, the sound of hooves on packed earth made her freeze. A figure emerged from the shadows of the barn. Levi limping slightly, his face pale in the starlight. "Going somewhere?" he asked softly. There was no anger in his voice, only a deep sadness that broke Sarah's heart anew. "I have to," she whispered, the trunk still in her arms. "Don't you see? I'm the reason everything's falling apart. If I leave—" "If you go," Levi interrupted, his quiet voice carrying clearly in the pre-dawn stillness, "then everything I've stood for falls with you." Kai took a step closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "Every principle I've defended, every truth I've claimed about God's love being greater than man's judgment, it all crumbles if I let fear drive you away." Sarah's arms trembled under the trunk's weight. "But the farm, your place in the community. I'm your burden, Levi. I've cost you so much." Levi closed the distance between them in 3 steps. Gently, he took the trunk from her grasp and set it aside. Then he gathered her into his arms, holding her as she began to weep. "You are my blessing, Sarah, never my burden," he murmured into her hair. "God sent you to teach me what real faith looks like. Faith that stands when the whole world says to bend. Stay. Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Sarah pressed her face against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. All her carefully constructed reasons for leaving dissolved in the warmth of his embrace. She nodded, unable to speak through her tears. Together they watched the sun rise over their threatened farm, painting the sky in shades of promise. The future remained uncertain, but they would meet it side by side, their love stronger for having been tested in fire. The first snow arrived before the harvest moon had waned, blanketing the Kansas prairie in white silence. Sarah stood at the window of their small farmhouse, watching crystalline flakes swirl against the darkening sky. Behind her, Levi tended the wood stove, his movements careful and deliberate despite his lingering weakness. Their stored supplies, meager from the drought-stricken summer, lined the root cellar in neat but sparse rows. Each morning, Sarah counted the jars and sacks, calculating how long they might last. Each evening, she tried not to notice how Levi took less food for himself, ensuring she had enough. The cattle suffered first. One bitter morning, Levi found 2 young calves frozen in the barn, despite the extra hay he'd packed around them. Sarah watched him dig graves in the hard earth, his shoulders bent under more than just the weight of his shovel. That night, she heard him praying long after he thought she'd fallen asleep, his voice rough with emotion as he asked for strength to endure. Yet even in the grip of winter's trial, they found moments of grace. Together they worked the days away, Sarah wielding an axe alongside Levi as they cut and split logs for the woodpile. Her arms grew stronger, her aim truer, and sometimes Levi's quiet laugh would drift across the yard when she landed a particularly good strike. In the evenings, they sat close by the fire's warmth, sharing a single blanket as Sarah read from the Book of Psalms. Her voice gave life to ancient words of praise and lament, hope and perseverance. Levi would close his eyes, letting the familiar verses wash over him like healing water. "The Lord is my shepherd," Sarah read one night, the wind howling outside their walls. "I shall not want." Levi's hand found hers in the lamplight. "Even now," he whispered. She squeezed his fingers. "Especially now." The storm that brought their visitors struck 3 days later, driving snow and ice before it like a biblical plague. The first knock came just after sunset, barely audible above the wind's roar. Sarah opened the door to find the Miller family from town. Parents and 3 small children, their faces pinched with cold and hunger. "Our well's frozen solid," Mrs. Miller explained, shame coloring her words. "We heard you still had water." Before she could finish, Sarah had drawn them inside, already moving to stoke the fire higher. More knocks followed as the evening deepened. The Petersons from the South Farm, the widow Jenkins and her son, even the Cooper family, who had turned their backs months ago when the shunning began. Sarah and Levi welcomed them all. They shared their precious water, brought up from the spring that never quite froze. Sarah stretched their last beans and cornmeal into a thin but warming soup. When she hesitated over opening their final jar of preserved peaches, Levi touched her arm gently. "The Lord multiplies when we give," he said, his eyes bright with something that looked like joy. That night, 20 people crowded into their small house, sharing food and warmth and stories until the storm began to ease. Word of their generosity spread through the county like spring thaw. Those they had helped returned with what they could spare, a handful of eggs here, a measure of flour there. The Cooper boy brought a load of wood he'd cut himself. Widow Jenkins insisted on sharing her carefully hoarded coffee beans. Even those who had been most vocal in condemning their marriage fell silent, then began to nod in greeting when they passed. The change was subtle at first, like snow melting beneath the surface, while the top still looked frozen. But it grew, day by day, until even the most hardened hearts showed signs of softening. One particularly cold morning, a rider brought a letter sealed with red wax, the bishop's mark. Sarah watched Levi's face as he held it, seeing the conflict in his eyes. They both knew this letter could either heal or deepen the wounds of the past year. Levi's hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal. Sarah moved closer, her arm pressing against his in silent support. The letter was brief, just a few lines of careful script, but they contained words neither had dared hope to hear. "Perhaps we judged too swiftly." Levi read these words aloud, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah wrapped her arms around him as tears filled both their eyes, tears of relief, of vindication, of grace long awaited and finally given. Outside their window, the winter sun broke through the clouds, setting the snow-covered fields ablaze with light. The first hints of spring whispered across the Kansas prairie as February drew to a close. Snow retreated in patches, revealing mud and dormant grass beneath. One crisp morning, Sarah stood on their porch, coffee cup, warming her hands, when she spotted movement on the horizon. A line of wagons and buggies approached through the morning mist. Her heart quickened as she recognized the lead buggy. Bishop Amos Yoder himself sat at the reins. Behind him came what looked like half the town, tools gleaming in their wagon beds. "Levi," she called softly. "Come see." He emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his trousers. Together they watched the procession arrive, neither speaking but their shoulders touching in silent support. The bishop stepped down first, his stern face softened by something that might have been humility. "Brother Levi," he said, "we have come to help dig your well." Behind him, Thomas Blakely climbed down from his own wagon, now stripped of its usual city polish. "I've brought lumber," he announced, gesturing to the stacks in his wagon bed, "for new fencing and to shore up the well walls." Men began unloading tools, shovels, picks, augers for drilling deep. Women carrying baskets of food followed, nodding respectfully to Sarah. The transformation from rejection to community support brought tears to her eyes. As the men gathered around the chosen spot near the barn, Sarah organized the women into an impromptu choir. Their voices rose clear and strong across the homestead, carrying old hymns of praise and perseverance. The sound seemed to give strength to the diggers as they worked through the morning hours. The ground fought them every inch, dry and unyielding despite the winter's moisture. By mid-afternoon, doubt began creeping into tired faces. The hole gaped wide and deep, but no water appeared. Then, just as the sun began its westward slide, a shout echoed from the bottom of the shaft. "Water! I've struck water!" The crowd surged forward as clear liquid began seeping, then gushing from the earth. Cheers and laughter erupted across the homestead. Men clapped each other's backs while women wiped tears from their eyes. Sarah fell to her knees in the mud, overcome with gratitude. Levi knelt beside her, taking her work-roughened hand in his. Before the gathered crowd, he spoke with quiet conviction. "This woman is my blessing." Bishop Yoder stepped forward, his head bowed. "Amen," he murmured, and the word was echoed by dozens of voices. As if heaven itself approved, a gentle rain began to fall, its soft patter mixing with joyful voices and the sound of running water. Sarah lifted her face to the sky, letting the drops mingle with her tears of joy. At last, the desert of rejection had bloomed into acceptance, and their faithfulness had been rewarded with abundance. Spring of 1882 painted the Kansas prairie in strokes of emerald and gold. The wheat in Levi's fields stood tall and proud, swaying like waves in the gentle breeze. Behind the farmhouse, Sarah's vegetable garden flourished, its neat rows bursting with tender shoots and promising buds. But it was the sound of children's laughter that truly marked the seasons. Renewal. Annie, Daniel, and Ruthie, survivors of a tragic wagon train fire, had brought fresh life to the once quiet homestead. Their small feet pattered across wooden floors that had known too much silence, their voices filling empty corners with songs and stories. "Miss Sarah," called 12-year-old Annie from the kitchen door, "the bread's rising just like you showed me." Her dark eyes, bearing hints of her Cherokee heritage, sparkled with pride. Sarah smiled, wiping soil from her hands. "You're becoming quite the baker, child." Inside, 6-year-old Ruthie sat at the table, carefully forming letters in her primer while 10-year-old Daniel fed kindling into the cook stove. The scene brought tears to Sarah's eyes, not of sorrow this time, but of quiet joy. Sunday gatherings had become a cherished tradition. Neighbors brought dishes to share, spreading blankets beneath the apple trees that now showed their first pale green buds. Even Thomas Blakely, humbled by grace and transformed by faith, joined them regularly. He would arrive in his delivery wagon, bringing supplies and staying for prayer, his once proud manner replaced by genuine humility. "The Lord does work in mysterious ways," he'd said just last Sunday, eyes downcast. "I never thought my greatest blessing would come from my greatest shame." The evening sun painted the sky in shades of rose and amber as Sarah stood at the garden fence, watching Levi with young Daniel. Her husband's patient hands guided the boy's smaller ones on the plow handles, teaching him the ancient rhythm of turning soil. "Keep it steady," Levi's gentle voice carried on the evening air. "That's the way. Just like that." Sarah's heart swelled with gratitude. How far they had come from that bitter January day at the train station. The rejection that had felt like an ending had instead been God's beginning. She whispered a prayer of thanks, words carried away by the sweet spring breeze. Through the window, lamplight spilled across the yard, warm, welcoming, and sure. The farmhouse that had once echoed with loneliness now hummed with life and purpose. Books lay open on tables, children's drawings decorated walls, and love flowed as freely as the well water that had marked their redemption. Looking at her home, truly her home now, Sarah understood deep in her soul that no rejection could stand against the power of mercy. God's grace, like the spring itself, made all things new. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.